his personality, but at the end of such thoughts,
Chapter 22 Harnessing Rage. Asterisk Battleground, Osaka asterisk. Drake watched the engagement through the eyes of Issei. The clash of his scion partner with their foe. Drake felt the power of Issei's ki surge to incredible heights as he drove the Kaioken-fueled Gallic gun further. Drake felt his own despair at seeing the fate of Akino and the overwhelming unstoppable force that it unleashed within his host. The mindscape shook and throbbed, the air grew thicker with more ki, raw and potent, more so than the mighty dragon had ever experienced. The air shimmered and burnt with power before with an ear-splitting crack, the dam containing Issei's potential burst. Golden energy flooded and Drake felt power more overwhelming than anything he had ever before. Greater than himself and primal, all-consuming and unstoppable. He was transfixed. This was more than he could have expected, and he knew exactly what it meant. Issei was no longer the scion he had been that morning. Issei was now a super scion. Issei was floating slightly above the wreckage of the apartment flooring below his feet. His eyes stared coldly at the grim adversary before him. His aura had calmed and his mind cleared. He still felt immense rage, anger, and hatred, but now it was tempered. Focused into a razor-sharp point, his mind working in pure calculation. All compassion and mercy had been wiped clean. He would kill, he would render this foe apart. The distortions created by his immense eruption of ki stopped abruptly and gravity wrenched the torn chunks of masonry and earth back to the ground far below as the remaining vestiges of the building were unable to bear the force of pressure upon them and succumbed to their inevitable collapse. The power he felt was truly incredible, but Issei was too focused to marvel at what he now possessed. Only destroying Kokobile remained relevant in his mind at this moment. The shock in the fallen angel's eyes left with a sneer replacing it, while another change too was all he got out as before he could even hope to register the movement, Issei had shot forward and firmly planted his left fist so deeply in Kokobile's abdomen that he felt himself pulled forward with spit and blood projecting from his mouth. His eyes bulged and all the oxygen in his lungs was forced out from the single blow. Before he could fall forward, Issei's right hand clenched around his throat, applying an absolutely crippling amounts of pressure. As he squeezed, his knuckles whitened with blood staining his fingertips as the digits pierced Kokobile's alabaster skin. His fist withdrew before burying back into the Grigori leader over and over. Strangled cries of pain tried to escape the older man's throat but failed. Unable to proceed through the blocked passage of his throat. Kokobile snarled in rage, he would not be beaten by this boy. He wasn't sure of where Issei had pulled this power from, but he would never lose to it. His hands turned sickly grayish hue as he clawed at the hand choking the air from him, desperately prying at the vice-like grip that was promising him only death. His knees and feet struck harmlessly against the scion. Knees and kicks that easily had enough power to split humans apart did nothing when crashing against the titanium-like resistance of the warrior before him. With their eyes locked together, Kokobile saw only merciless hate within the cold sky blue that bored into his own. The stare held a trance-like power, preventing the Grigori leader from breaking away despite himself wanting to. Issei felt ribs shattering, organs liquefying, and skin tearing in the abdomen of his foe. He would reduce this being to nothing more than mutilated body parts before killing him. He would inflict such pain and humiliation upon his foe that the enemy would never dare to face him again. Releasing his hand from his opponent's throat, Issei flicked his hands up, both grasping onto the anchors of the angel's top wings. Pivoting himself back, he slammed his knees into his opponent's chest before driving his legs forward and his arms back. His opponent flailed in pain, light spears forming in his hands that shattered upon contact with the raging golden aura of the scion. Kokobile screamed out in pain as his top wings firmly within the grasp of the scion tore from his body. Immediately discarding the bloody appendages from his hands, Issei caught the falling body of his enemy who was unable to beat his wings to stay afloat with the pain inflicted by the scion. Blood flowed freely from his stomach and back while it oozed from the gauges to his throat. Looking beyond the angel, Issei identified the glow of the giant phoenix in the distance and locked his sights onto the flaming bird as his target. Like a dreidel, Issei began to spit on the spot, his body becoming a golden blur. The speed he rotated, creating gusts of wind that rushed out and tore into buildings, destroying landscapes and causing further damage to the deserted structures of the Kogai around them. With his enemy completely at his mercy, Issei stopped abruptly, releasing his adversary and projecting him like a shot toward the phoenix with pinpoint accuracy. The fallen angel was launched with such intensity that a boom ripped through the air as the sound barrier was broken and the bleeding mutilated body passed the point of pilots losing consciousness from sudden, rapid acceleration. Rias ducked and wove through wild swipes of Riser's claws. His assault against the devils was becoming more ferocious and desperate after the effect of the lightning threatening to destroy his soaked body. His regeneration had saved him, however, at a heavy price in terms of energy, and now, just like his ratings game fight with Issei, he was reaching a dangerously low level of reserves to continue the fight, and he was well aware that he would have to finish the devils sooner rather than later. Rias unleashed a quick volley of blasts against his exposed belly while Sebastian struck out with arcs of sparking energy to keep his guard open. Darting back out of his reach, Ria's scouter registered a sharp increase in Issei's power doubling, and she risked a glance over in time to see the telltale purple of his Gallic gun with a tremendous tower of red ki from his Kaioken. He had pushed it higher than she had witnessed before, and the gnaw of worry clutched at her stomach briefly. She had seen the risks of the technique from his battle with Biko, and now he had gone further. He was a lot stronger through his intense training, his Zenkai, and controlling his ki. His reserves multiples of times larger than they previously had been. Rias turned her head back to focus on her target when an explosion of the energy sent a shockwave rippling through the air. Her head whipped back to see the remnants of dust and debris floating where the Gallic gun had exploded against the opposing energy attack. She was about to question what was going on when a bellowing scream of pure rage and fury filled the air along with tremendous pulses of raw, unbridled energy. Her scouter shot up in readings, though it was seemingly unable to comprehend the power that it was registering, as if this power was just more than the computer could comprehend. It no longer displayed the ratings or number of key signatures of those around her and appeared to be going through an internal reboot. Pure pulses of energy ripped through the air, the shockwaves slammed into the devils and phoenix indiscriminately, forcing their fight to a halt as all struggled to maintain their ability to fly. All watched the pulses of light erupting from the Scion's location. Large portions of earth and broken structures rose high into the air as lightning formed from seemingly nowhere and crashed to the ground around the epicenter of the power surge. The bellow of anguish raised higher, and the voice was distinctive and clear to Rias' mind. There was no doubt that it was Issei. The shout reached its apex and then calm hit for a moment before both gravity resumed and an eruption of golden light shone out from the Scion's location. A comet of golden light shot forward and began unleashing a hailstorm of malicious attacks into its target before the object of its ire came rocketing toward them at speeds that were close to indescribable. A heavy thwack filled the air along with the crunch of shattered limbs as the object plowed into the phoenix. The great bird was completely startled and confused while holding the object in its oversized avian claws. Rias felt her eyes widen further in amazement and shock. Kokobile, beaten heavily, a pair of wings torn off from his back, his body broken and mutilated to almost a loss of recognition, he hung limply and barely conscious within the clutches of Riser's right claw. Another crack announced a presence arriving to the aerial battlefield at phenomenal speeds. Golden light filled the air, pulsing and causing vibrations of energy, drawing awe from everyone who witnessed it. Rias turned, she recognized the light and she recognized the boy, but she had never seen them together in the same person. Issei floated with a look of pure rage and hatred plastered across his face. His hair stood upright and a bright yellow blonde, his tail the same color. Eyes a cold sky blue that were merciless and beyond anything the happy boy she loved had ever produced. His body expanded with further muscle mass that emanated incredible power, and his raging golden aura alight around him in a display of unstoppable awe-inspiring power. A sign that a warrior of such unexplainable and calamitious power walked the earth. Rias felt her mouth fall open and silence filled the air as none were quite prepared to see Issei before them like a shining golden god. Issei broke the silence with words that shattered the awe of the moment and filled Rias with pain. He killed her. He killed Akino. As those words left his lips, Issei shot forward again in such a speed that to those witnessing it appeared as if he teleported into his target. His fists and limbs were of supersonic strikes against the fallen angel. A backhand strike shattered the Phoenix's talon, holding the Grigori leader and releasing him to the Scion's onslaught. Kokobile attempted as best as possible to protect his organs. Blood loss, combined with the rapid strikes of Issei driving him close to losing consciousness, his jaw shattered from a left cross. His ribs completely eviscerated. Left leg broken high on the thigh and right arm broken in so many places that it appeared to be nothing more than a deformed appendage of flesh. All within 30 seconds of the murderous Golden Scion's assault. The Phoenix shot forward with its beak to intervene and was rewarded with a fist that shattered the beak and drove the giant avian's head back, causing delirium. Rhea stared in pain shock at the scene before her. She wasn't really taking it in. Issei's words just played like stabs of ice within her brain, unavoidable and destroying all other thought. She looked around, Akino wasn't there. She looked over to where Issei had been, her queen wasn't there either. She was brought out of her stupor by the ping of her scouter successfully rebooting. Quickly Rias conducted a scan, looking for Akino's signature. Issei came up first, his power over 20 times that of where it had been when it peaked during his Kaioken. Kokobile and Riser flashed across, her group fighting the Phoenix, herself and Irina so far below them. Then the emergency workers and humans in the area, but no Akino. The girl didn't show. Her signature was nowhere, she couldn't be found. Tears welled in her eyes, they ran down her face as a sob threatened to break out of her throat. Akino was gone. Her best friend and lover was gone. She looked over to the man who had done it. The one who had discarded her, caused her so much pain. She looked on with hatred to what was happening to him. No wings remained on his back, torn harshly from his body by the Scion that held him and was now smashing his body against the giant bird repeatedly like a crude bloody bat. Issei finished beating Kokobile's body into the Phoenix and shot toward the bird while holding the Grigori leader once again by the throat. Riser panicked and unleashed a gout of flame at the Scion who simply flew into and through the searing jet of fire. His clothes were incinerated instantly, yet his body remained untouched. The same could not be said for his prisoner, whose remaining skin bubbled with burns and blisters, the intense heat cauterizing his wounds and prolonging the pain that the murderous Scion could put him through. Issei, emerging completely unscathed, caused Riser to rear back in fright. The shining epitaph of power that Issei had become causing terror to well up within himself. This ends now. Issei spat coldly. He wrapped the sinew of Kokobile's neck into the pit of his arm while locking eyes with Riser's avian ones. With a squeeze of his bicep and a harsh twist and crunch, Kokobile's neck snapped and his remaining nerves began to spasm sharply, firing off the last of their commands as death's cold embrace began to claim control of his body. Without a word or look toward the once imposing enemy, Issei dropped Kokobile's body and fired himself at the Phoenix, still intent on causing more pain to his enemies. Rias watched as Issei dealt the final lethal squeeze to Kokobile without even the slightest effort. Someone who less than an hour ago had held immense power, far beyond them, but was now nothing but a punching bag, a rag doll for the mighty Scion, so absolute was Issei's new power. As Issei shot forward with a flurry of blows that quickly overwhelmed the defenses of Riser and had the giant avian crying out in pain, the body of the man that had killed her beloved Akino fell to the ground. Ignoring Issei, Rias shot down and caught him harshly, her hand digging into the twisted and mutilated flesh of his destroyed abdomen. Gurgling and choking came from his mouth. Her scouter registered barely any power around that of a human. He was moments from death. She turned his head to face hers, snapping and popping, filling the air from the tendons that severed in her harsh movement. His right eye missing and left heavily swollen, she leant in so that he could hear her hate-filled words. "You will never be reincarnated." Satisfied that he knew that knowledge, if only subconsciously, Rias released him and drove a pulse of destruction energy into his body. The magic surged through him, eviscerating his remaining flesh and erasing him from existence. Her tears flowed freely from both of her eyes and ran heavily down her cheeks as she floated there below the scene above. The cries of the phoenix filled the air and its light was eclipsed by the incredible aura of Issei. Rias took a moment to let her emotions flow, to let her pain and sadness fall silently from her body before she wiped them and looked up. Issei held the head of the great avian and repeatedly struck it, the bird dropping in and out of consciousness as the effects of his regenerative powers took longer and longer to work until they finally didn't. After the seventh strike, the monster thrashed, its body shaking and pulsing until twisting back into that of a heavily wounded and bleeding blond man, naked and covered in gashes, grazes and contusions, broken bones and unconscious. Issei stared uncaring at the man. He had won, this threat was defeated. His mind didn't care for anything else. He looked away from the body in his hands toward the remaining devils for the first time since his transformation. Stares of absolute awe, amazement, anger and confusion filled their faces. Sadness marred those of the Gremory peerage as well. Sarah looked on the verge of collapsing, tears falling freely from her eyes in time with her sobs as Kaneko held her. At having heard Issei's statement clearly and checking the key around them with their own scouters, the reality of Akino's death was clear for all to see. None moved to intervene, they allowed the grief-stricken scion to unleash his rage against both foes. When finally Issei remained holding the unconscious form of Riser, Ravel moved forward. Issei, she began in a hesitant and soft voice. The young noble was usually so confident, but faced with what Issei had become and seeing the unimaginable power he possessed, she was unsure. Wait, don't kill him. Not yet. Surzex will want to interrogate him. There is still a lot we need to know. Issei locked eyes with the blonde girl speaking to him. She looked awkwardly at him and he realized that the flames of the phoenix had destroyed his clothes. Uncaring, Issei tossed the body of her brother to her before floating over to Rias. He could feel the key of the group leaving as they gave space to the stricken pair who continued to float in the air. Issei simply remained unmoving before Rias, who stared at him. Pain and sadness filled her eyes. It overflowed from her soul as she stared at the boy before her. His aura and visage of power and rage now twisted into that of pain and sorrow much like hers. Issei wrapped his arms around her, the pair floating together in an embrace of mutual hurt. His aura gone yet hair still waving upward, illuminated in a bright golden yellow. Minutes passed by as the two powerful beings simply stayed airborne together. Rias' tears stained Issei's chest and ran down him. Neither cared nor did anything to change his state of nudity. The hum of engines filled the air as helicopters with searchlights began moving through the rubble and fire service personnel extinguished the remaining fires below in the decimated portion of the city that has served as Issei's battlefield. The rumbling noise broke the trance on the pair who met each other's eyes. The sparkling aquamarine of Rias locked with the sky blue of Issei. She took in a massive breath before releasing it and speaking in a somber voice. Her eyes now dried and a look of duty to her face. We have to go down there. We have to clean up, report and be responsible. Issei simply nodded. He closed his eyes and took a few deep breaths. He felt the power within himself. He felt how it pulsed through him. He committed every inch of it to memory, the vivid memory of it exploding within him already seared into his mind. With a last long breath, he released his hold on the power and felt it fall away, locking itself back into his body. Instantly exhaustion and pain flooded Issei as his golden aura dissipated and his hair and eyes returned to their natural hues. Injuries and fatigue that he hadn't felt before now flared up within him, making themselves known. He took a few quick breaths to steady himself. He wouldn't let it overwhelm him, he would remain in control. The feeling of fabric forming around himself barely registerable as he completed his control of himself, and Issei opened his eyes to find Rias had summoned his clothes back onto himself. He smiled somberly at her before twisting over and still carrying the girl in his arms, he flew down toward where he could feel his friends. Rias folded her wings in and allowed the scion to carry her down in their intimate embrace. Issei landed close to the group of supernatural citizens. Rias exited his arms while Irina made introductions between her and the chief inspector, who seemed to be at a point of just accepting what was told to him without argument. He didn't bat an eyelid at being told an almost 17-year-old girl was the leader of the group. Too much weirdness had already occurred that night for him to argue further. So the one who caused all this damage, the senior officer, began. Dead. Rias replied flatly to the man. His associate here will be taken into my custody and face imprisonment within hell. The man spared a glance at the beaten and unconscious man. What of the giant firebird monster? He inquired next. He really didn't want it to still be alive, waiting and lurking to strike once those capable of facing it had left. Rias simply thumbed back toward Riser again in Ravel's arms. He was the Phoenix. As you can see, he won't be causing issues again. Rias looked around at the devastation caused by the fight. Fires had spread from Riser's attacks. The initial fight had caused tremendous damage alone, and then far more had been caused by Issei's destructive bout with Kokobile. Someone will be in contact regarding the damages caused. For now though, we will be leaving. Chief Inspector Ryota looked as if he wanted to protest the idea of them all leaving. This was a crime scene or war zone or battleground. He wasn't sure what it classified as, but he knew that due process was required. Reports would need to be wrote and filed. Statements taken to work out exactly what had happened. But with all that said, this girl's blunt responses made it clear that she was going to do as she pleased regardless. There was really no way that he could force them to stay anyway. They looked bruised, battered and tired, but he wasn't foolish enough to think that his men were now on a level playing field with these supernatural beings. So in the end, he simply nodded and gave a non-committal response to the red-haired girl before choosing to move away. There was something about the group that gave him an uncomfortable feeling, especially the aura of melancholy and barely contained rage that emanated from the girl and heavily muscular, tail boy. Irina moved forward to the group and quietly congratulated them on winning the fight while offering her condolences for the fate of Aquino. Rias accepted her words before she summoned the Gremory sigil, which caused the officers all around to either stare directly or steal glances at the red emblem adorning the ground. Everyone but Issei entered the sigil. I will come home soon, there is just something I have to do first. Rias looked at him intensely for a moment. She wanted Issei to be beside her, but it was plain for everyone to see the storm of emotions raging in the teenage boy. She would have to trust that he knew what he was doing. A worry in the back of her mind was that he was going to rush off to fight Biko. Now that he had achieved the Super Saiyan once, would he try again immediately? Rias locked eyes with him. There wasn't the usual drive that would have marked him for doing something so foolish within them. Issei embraced her and planted his lips on hers for a tender kiss that caused those observing to look away in embarrassment. Their lips broke apart and Issei floated up into the air and away as the flash of crimson light signaled the departure of the Gremory group. Issei soared throughout the darkness without his aura flaring, becoming almost invisible in the night sky as he moved. He felt a mixture of exhaustion and pain flooding his body, but he was focused at the moment. He would let his body rest once he had achieved this small task he set himself. It was something that had to be done. He soared over to the conflict ground of his battle with Kokobile. It had previously been a series of apartment blocks and small stores, convenience shops, cafes, and the like. Now it was an immense mountain of rubble and felt devoid of life. Kokobile's spell had ripped the life from the ground just as the compressed blade had done from Aquino. The thought of it caused anger to flare within Issei, but he wouldn't let it overwhelm him. He would remain as calm as he could. Later was the time for emotion, now was the time for focus. Issei found the disheveled mass of rubble that formed the site of his transformation. Looking on at the scorched rubble and eviscerated ground, he couldn't help but feel the Saiyan twinge of excitement. He has achieved the form of a Super Saiyan, the power, strength, speed, and unstoppable endurance. He knew it would form the crux of his training from now on. Issei landed down and looked through the rocks and concrete, broken furniture and shattered belongings of the occupants that had evacuated. This was going to be an expensive insurance claim and he was immediately remorseful for the damage caused to people's lives, but it was nothing compared to the destruction Kokobile and Riser had planned in pursuit of their new god.
A harsh snap resounded through the
Gently
air.
Issei searched through the rubble for close to half an hour before coming to what he had sought.
The other two
A scouter with torn and bloody clothes discarded.
It was clear that
Akino's belongings.
and really didn't want to
Issei picked them up and held them in his arms. He placed the scouter over his left eye. Immediately, the device registered as Akino's belonging. Issei stared at the name clearly on the screen before thinking of her as deceased. The thought flashed through the neural link of the device, and then a moment later the device reset, calibrated, and set itself anew. Issei repeated his thought that it was still Akino's over and over. Due to either the device's artificial intelligence or complex programming, Issei wasn't sure which, it registered his thoughts. The full interface displayed for him to use, but the owner was still marked as Akino, his keepsake of her. Issei clutched the bundle of clothes up carefully within his arms before raising high into the cold night air once more. He knew the general direction to Kuo and so began to fly toward it. He soared higher into the air and picked up to a rapid pace that would allow him to reach home within half an hour. Clouds formed in the sky and Issei sailed through them. The moisture clung to him and left a wetness to his clothes that cooled him. He allowed it to remain until it began to cause an unpleasant chill. Issei remedied this through flaring his ki briefly, instantly drying himself.
The man's eyes bulged.
As he approached, the hierarchy signatures of his friends shone brightly along with that of some local devils that Issei recognized, Sona and her peerage. Issei released his aura and coasted in toward his home. 3 seniors were present within the dwelling, 1 large, 2 small. Rias and his parents. He found Saras with Kaneko a few doors down. He understood that the young girl would choose to be with the other girl that she had connected to most. Akino had meant much to her, close to what she meant to Issei and Rias. He released his ki and allowed gravity to accelerate his descent, utilizing only enough energy to avoid creating an impact crater upon landing, instead slowing to the pace of a step as he touched down in front of his home. Without waiting, Issei opened the door, the house mostly dark with the glow of light from the living room creating a faint level of visibility in the hallway. Voices softly emanated into the air. Soft enough that the average human wouldn't be able to make out the words, yet clear to Issei's ears. But you haven't told your family yet. His mother's voice spoke, clearly speaking with Rias. His parents had been more receptive of both girls than Issei had expected them to be. It was strange to now think one was no longer with them. He made his way down the hallway to come into the lit room. His mother sat beside Rias on the large couch with her arm around the devil heiress in a calming embrace while his father sat alone on the adjacent smaller one. The pair wore expressions of condolence and sadness. They hadn't known Akino for longer than close to a month, yet within that time they had both grown to find her to be a ray of sunshine who enhanced the days of those around her. Rias had clearly cried further as Issei could make out the dried streaks on her cheeks. He expected that many more tears would fall. Looking at hers, Issei was worried about whether he would allow his own to fall. Would it result in his losing control of the power that he barely had a grasp over? His parents looked toward him as Rias used the excuse to escape his mother's embrace. You got Akino's scouter and clothes, Rias stated. It was plain to see, and Issei simply confirmed with a nod. The Gremory heiress felt a slight warmth at the show of care displayed by Issei. Her worry over his actions melting away as she realized they were unwarranted at this time. She was still concerned that sooner rather than later he would be out seeking the opponent who had defeated him so thoroughly. I want to bury the clothes. There was no body after what he did. These were what she had. The small warmth left Rias at thinking again of what Kokobile had taken from them. She agreed with Issei's reasoning though. I will keep her scouter though. Mine was destroyed. Rias didn't argue against him. She couldn't deny him the small device. She stepped forward toward Issei while forming the Gremory sigil softly on the carpeted floor. Issei knew what was happening. Rias didn't want to go to hell without him. He knew a lot of questions were coming. Hopefully rest would follow. Issei looked to his parents as Rias joined him and he wrapped an arm around her. Both of his parents could see the internal struggle within their son to contain and control his emotions. The cold and dry exterior was nothing but a hollow shell containing the raging mass of anger, despair and sorrow within. "We will be back soon." Without waiting for a reply, the pair vanished. Asterisk Gremory Mansion, Hell asterisk. Chaotic was an understatement for the frantic scene unfolding around Surzex. The light resistance expected against his sister's group had been far heavier than he could have predicted, and predicting these things was something he prided himself upon. Reports that came in suggested a vast host of abyssal creatures, Grigori, and rogue devils. If the group had been any other, then he would have been truly worried. He was still heavily concerned, but the knowledge that Issei was there reassured him for the most part. For considering the power that the scouter registered within Issei, surely the scion would mop up any who were foolish enough to engage him. He had instead focused on the coordination of further efforts across the earth. Teams were raiding enemy locations, primarily for the purpose of finding the cache of unholy stones they had formed, as well as identifying and targeting the enemy's leadership. That was the strategy that had been agreed on by the Allies. Destroy the crystals created before they could be used and kill the enemy leadership. Once disorganized and with their efforts destroyed, the enemy should disband and go back to fighting among themselves. Surzex's calm of the situation in Osaka had been shattered by the frantic reports of sightings of both the Phoenix form of Riser Phoenix and Cokebeal converging on the location of his sister's group. All their time spent looking for them, and now the enemy were heading straight for his family. Surzex hoped that Rias would get her team to withdraw, move back to Hell, and allow a professional combat team to handle the enemy. He was well aware that Cokebeal held an immense amount of power, most likely stronger than his own. He was also aware that Issei would never back down and that the scion would fight even if ordered not to. Surzex promptly demanded as much information on the situation as he could get. Within 5 minutes, a devil capable of scrying was before him, and a large translucent mirror shimmered before producing a bird's-eye view of the scene that was unfolding in Osaka. Surzex's stomach dropped. His sister and the majority of her group were engaged in combat with the Phoenix of Riser Gremory, while Issei fought Cokebeal seemingly alone. The red aura of the Kaioken raged around the boy as the two monstrous powers unleashed devastating blows against each other in. Surzex watched on as the fight raged. His first impulse was to teleport to the site immediately and help out. That was shot down promptly by Grafia, who, always the more reasonable strategic thinker of the pair, noted that they still had a lot of other objectives being pursued, and with Issei being as powerful as he was, would Surzex's arrival really assist or simply hinder in the fight with their enemy? It was clear from the scry that the majority of the group were handling Riser well enough, while Cokebeal and Issei fought at a level entirely beyond anything that was close to reasonable. Surzex grit his teeth at the forced sidelining of this fight. Engaging Cokebeal was the last thing he had wanted Rias to do, and yet that was what had happened. The scry cut out abruptly as Issei's Gallic gun exploded upon the light attack generated from Cokebeal, and further attempts to view the situation were met with frustrating failure. Surzex began demanding even more attempts be made to observe the situation and immediately gave orders for an intervention force to be mobilized and ready to deploy. Within 10 minutes, a force of 24 well-armed and armored devils awaited deployment by the Lord of Hell. They were a retinue designed to intercept and eliminate high-value opposition, and had recently been preparing for a confrontation with Cokebeal. As such, a quick description of the area was given by a staff member of Surzex. The team made a final check of their equipment, readying themselves to jump directly into conflict when Grafia's voice filled the air. "Wait!" A commanding tone stopping the devils. Their commander, an older devil wielding a large crimson battle axe, turned to the Queen of Hell. His expression was a clear question of why they would be halted from such an important situation. A phone was to Grafia's ear. She listened for a further moment before looking incredulously toward the awaiting squad of trained professionals. "I don't have all the facts, but it seems we will be sending a cleanup liaison, not a combat team." She departed back to the situation room without a further word, and the commander commander was left with the questions of what exactly had happened. Graphia returned to her husband feeling entirely uncertain about the situation. Surely they should be happy about Rias' news. She had reported Cocobil's death and shortly after Ravel had arrived with her unconscious brother, and yet it was clear that the Jubilian time had been marred by something bad. Rias was very cold in her speech and Ravel refused to elaborate, simply stating that it was definitely not her place. Graphia would have pushed further but knew Rias would be in within the next few hours and she could wait. The confirmation of Cocobil's death opened up their freedom of action a lot. He was the main threat to their forces. With him dispatched, they could respond more decisively to Grigori actions. Rias and Issei arrived in the mansion of her family to find it a hive of activity. Members of the family's staff moved from tightly packed room to further packed rooms. Martial was the only word to describe the atmosphere. Immediately, servants flocked to the pair. The news of the encounter with Cocobil had spread through the house faster the more that Surzex had tried to keep it quiet, so naturally the whole residence knew already. Leave us. Issei commanded harshly with a release of ki that flared his white aura, forcing those around him back and caused his tail to naturally uncurl from his waist. The servants backed away instantaneously, some shocked and others confused about the aggressive action of the usually friendly scion. Furthermore, the allowance of Rias in not refuting his actions caused more murmurs. The Gremory heiress was known for being openly friendly with all of the family's household regardless of their birth. Now she merely seemed cold in her look and made no effort to speak, simply walking toward the central rooms of the mansion that were being used as the command center during this crisis. None attempted to approach again as Issei allowed his aura to spark out from himself constantly. His face a mixture of underlying emotions and barely concealed rage. Hallways scattered of both soldiers and servants as the pair moved through. Surzex and Graphia met the two as they entered into the bustling room. Relief and underlining concern present on both their faces. The pair of older devils could sense the strong emotion around the two as well as the lacking presence of Aquino being a strange sight. For years the two girls had been nigh on inseparable. Cocobil is dead. Issei killed him. Has Ravel already delivered Riser? Rias' words firm with only a subtle quiver, something only those who truly knew and loved her could recognize. There was no joy to her words. Nothing of the girl that was always present. The pair then made to leave but were stopped by the Lord of Hell reaching out for his sister. Wait, what happened? He asked sincerely. The command room went quiet as all listened in to the conversation. Attraction being brought by both the topic and Issei's sparking white aura. Issei fought Cocobil. Issei won and broke his neck. I disintegrated him. Issei then beat Riser so much that he lost his transformation, consciousness, and we returned. Rias stated the facts only while tears began to well once again in her eyes, her vision on the floor and not looking at either her brother or his wife. But what's wrong? Where's Aquino? Surzex pushed further. The sharp intake of breaths from both along with the violent surge of Issei's aura confirmed that the reason for their emotional state was found. Rias simply opened and closed her mouth multiple times without any sound being produced. Seeing his girlfriend unable to verbalize what had occurred, Issei brought his eyes to both the Lord and Lady of Hell. The pair looked at the scion with worry. Cocobil killed her. As Issei spoke, his aura flicked violently again and both nobles of hell could swear a streak of gold flashed through momentarily before vanishing and only white remaining. If you want the full details, then we will explain them later. I can't now. Surzex wanted to accept the situation but knew that he had to press further to understand everything. He had seen Issei's tremendous explosion of power from the Kaioken, but looking at the cuts, grazes and injuries on the scion coupled with his evident emotional fatigue, Surzex was struggling to understand how he had succeeded over Cocobil. Surzex expected Issei to be in a similar state to how he was after his bout with Biko, but he seemed to have fared almost too well. How did you do it though? I achieved the transformation. Issei locked his eyes with the Lord of Hell. I surpassed myself and became a Super Saiyan. With that power, killing him was easy. Before Surzex could respond and push further, Issei squeezed Ria's shoulder gently. Let's go home. We need rest. Rias nodded while raising her head only to look at him. Without looking at her brother or his wife, she addressed them. Forgive our departure. You will need to send liaisons to Osaka. I told the local authorities that they could expect representatives to help with reconstruction soon. The two lovers moved together through the mansion before finding themselves in Ria's room. Together they sat on the edge of her large bed. Issei's arm around the shoulder of the girl as she pressed her face into his chest. Akino's clothes were delicately folded and placed onto the bedside table with her scouter atop them. Both remained silent. Now that they were alone in the empty room, the bustle of the rest of the mansion was separated from them by the emptiness of the rooms and halls around them. The occupants of the mansion wisely having chosen to avoid the grieving pair. The silence like a thick blanket that refused to release its hold on the room. Silent tears fell from Ria's eyes freely as she clutched onto the scion and wetness pulled in his own before falling as well. Pressing tasks and a sense of duty had kept the pair moving forward so far, but now, with nothing to distract them, they found themselves trapped in their own agony. Together but apart. Touching yet also alone in their minds. Time seemed to form an irrelevant background factor. 10 minutes could have passed or a few hours. Issei had no idea. The darkness of the closed room offered little in the way of clues, and as was typical of himself, he didn't have his phone with him. Thoughts of the dark-haired beauty flowed through Issei's mind. Their first kiss, teasing her. Her teasing of him, time spent together. Laughter and joy, now all tainted by sorrow. The feel of her skin, her smell, her smile, the connection of their naked bodies. All experiences and emotions that both lovers would cherish of their girlfriend but never experience again. Without being aware of it, fatigue and injury overcame him. Issei's mind and body were drained, his ki cut harshly but raw emotion sustaining its flow. He was only aware that he was no longer in the bedroom when the sound of Drake's breathing broke the air. Issei looked to the whiteness around him, the warmth in the air pressing into him before his eyes landed on the dragon. Drake's eyes held the same sorrow that Issei felt. Without a word, the Red Dragon Emperor gave a silent bow and the pair remained silent, simply looking at the white floor for 60 seconds. So Super Saiyan. The Great Dragon stated while now looking at Issei with a proud visage plastered over his sorrow at the loss of Akino. Drake understood Issei, he knew the Saiyan needed something to focus on now. Working to master and control the power that he had just achieved would be exactly that needed point. Issei nodded, yeah. I did. You felt it too, right? The incredible power it provided. I was indestructible. I would be willing to wager that destroying the planet would have been easier than me with that power. Issei pushed his dark emotions away, he buried them under his focus. He let his Saiyan instincts for battle, for improvement and his pride grasp onto the extraordinary and legendary power that he had grasped. Dealing with his emotions was a problem for later. If anyone else purported to be more resistant than a planet, I would call it meaningless hyperbole. But having felt that power, the surge of ki from within here, I agree. You are on a level I have never felt. Once again I am left amazed by the potential of a Saiyan. To have seen the ancient race in its prime. Millions of warriors capable of such a feat, I can only imagine how the universe would have trembled at their wrath. Yeah. Issei replied simply while smirking at the thoughts in his mind of countless Saiyan warriors, Super Saiyan or not, descending onto their enemy. Can you remember how the transformation felt? The process that your body undertook and what released the ki within yourself. Issei's smirk dropped as a serious expression replaced it. I do. I remember vividly the rush of power, the flow of energy and the cold calculation that overcame my mind. I can clearly feel the focus, the drive to fulfill my desires and the ease with which I could brush aside my raw emotions.
Its flesh and regeneration.
Issei floated into the air before moving a distance away from his dragon partner. He knew further manipulation of this powerful technique was going to be destructive, and having Drake too close would do the dragon no good. As he landed, the world around him shifted. No longer a white nothingness, but now an open grassy plain for as far as the eye could see. Greens, yellows and browns making up the matted and patchwork covering of short flora. A blue cloudless sky above and the sun beaming down upon the two sole occupants of this endless steppe. Now with hundreds of meters of distance between the two, Issei landed. The firm bed of earth beneath his feet, his toes tickled slightly by the soft grass. Issei cleared his mind as best as he could, with his focus honing in on what he was about to achieve. His scion genetics made it easier than he thought it would be. His breath came out slowly as Issei dug into his ki and raised it. Wind whipped up around him, gusts of air tearing at the ground as the white aura of the scion rose high around him. His exhaustion in the physical world being a mere memory now that he was present within his mindscape once more. His teeth ground together as he pushed more and more ki out. He could remember the feeling of the golden energy overflowing his senses, the rush of limitless unparalleled power, but now reaching it was like trying to lift a boulder from the bottom of a lava-filled volcano. It just wasn't coming. Frustration pushed into his psyche and Issei bellowed out with his emotions becoming less and less controlled. Rage and irritation at the fore of it all. Still, he couldn't trigger the explosive transition again. Something was preventing him. He felt his power peak and was tempted to utilize the Kaioken to drive it further. Perhaps that was the catalyst that had allowed him to transform. Reaching the Kaioken 10 had certainly driven his ki higher than ever before. A beating of wings joined the sounds that Issei registered, and he looked up through determined and infuriated eyes at the dragon above him. Focus on what drove you to access the power last time. Anger bit at Issei, that had been what he had been doing. Was Drake just going to offer pointless general advice or try to give him something of actual quality? Annoyed, the scion glared at the dragon as he continued to push his ki further in vain. There was a cracking in the ground as his energy pulsed through the air. Dirt chunks tore from the ground and rose up in defiance of gravity. Yet still the raise in his power was minimal. Focus! Drake bellowed and Issei glared at him further. The dragon wasn't really helping. Minutes turned into a quarter of an hour and then close to half an hour while Issei was unable to trigger the transformation again. Knowing he could do it, yet couldn't grasp it was wreaking havoc on his barely contained emotions, and before he could stop it, his mind shifted to the last images of Akino. Seeing her face filled with love and protecting care for him while also twisted in pain. The silent plead in her eyes as she was reduced to the fine red mist. A ripple shimmered through the air and Issei's power erupted monumentally past his current elevated state. His mouth let rip a bellowing roar and golden energy pulsed and rippled from him as his aura flashed first once golden, then a second and finally a third time before staying in the dazzling color. Issei finished his bellow and panted in a silent, controlled manner. He had achieved it again, his mind once more in a cold calm state, dominated by the power of the legendary form. Looking toward Drake, who now hovered in the air with his wings beating slowly, the Super Saiyan rose into the air and faced his partner at a close distance. Drake took in the image of his first in-person view of the cataclysmic transformation. Issei's hair and tail now a golden blonde and standing upward in defiance of gravity. His eyes a cold sky blue with a piercing gaze. His muscle mass increased substantially but in no way hindering his movements. The aura releasing pure golden light in a radiating manner that presented itself as the absolute pinnacle of performance beyond anything Drake could imagine. Incredible. Drake stated in awe. Never had he imagined that any entity could ever possess such strength and power. The gods themselves would be jealous of you. Issei simply smirked at the comment and began to examine himself. He flexed his muscles and truly felt his power. His first foray into this power had been spent focused on killing Kokobile and then beating Riser into a bloody pulp before relinquishing the power. Now, however, Issei could really examine and understand himself. His calm and calculating mind taking in each aspect of the change. His thoughts were interrupted by a question from Drake that would help him in the future. What triggered it this time? Issei thought briefly and realized that both transformations had the same trigger. Images of Akino's death flashed through my mind. I felt uncontrollable rage and anguish. More than ever. Powerful emotion is the catalyst then. Raw anger and anguish combined with having conditioned yourself to such an incredible height of strength. Issei listened to his partner's words and found himself nodding along with him. It made sense. The emotional trigger was what released the power, and without having trained himself to such a height, the transformation would have ripped him asunder. A lethal self-destruction far greater than simply depleting his own ki. Issei turned from the dragon and extended his right arm out with his palm toward the horizon. Bright blue and white ki swirled together into an orb the size of a cricket ball within his hand. Issei condensed and the power within the orb confined in upon itself, changing to a pulsing yellow and skyrocketing in destructive power. He shot the attack off into the distance and watched as it impacted with the ground kilometers away. A shockwave and mushroom cloud equivalent of a nuclear explosion resulting from the attack. The ripple passed Issei harmlessly, and once the dust had settled, revealed a crater within the grassland of substantial size. Easily 300 meters wide and equally deep. Issei barked out in laughter and excitement at the result. The attack had taken as much energy as his ki orbs always had, only now that he was transformed they were beyond a doubt infinitely more powerful. With a barrage of ki blasts he could now easily lay waste to a battlefield and countless enemies. Finding out how powerful his Gallic gun was now would be something he would do with enthusiasm, but Issei couldn't think of anything able to achieve a challenge for him to do so. Other than Biko, and now was not the time to challenge his rival. He would need to be able to call upon this transformation at will first. Turning to Drake, Issei let his grin morph into a challenging and cocky smirk. The dragon knew what was coming and shot toward the Super Saiyan with his full might. There would be no holding back against Issei in their duels now. With the dragon lunging toward him, Issei's smirk grew even wider. Drake's movements appeared to be in slow motion even though Issei was fully aware that his partner was coming at him with full force. It was beyond evident to the Saiyan that he now firmly grasped a power beyond that of Drake's own. A golden comet whipped around Drake, lashing out at the dragon with various strikes and blows. The dragon countered, blocked and struck as best he could. His blows amounted to little more than superfluous hits, however, his flames washing over Issei harmlessly, and it was becoming increasingly difficult for him to put up any resistance against the Saiyan. Issei broke away after their initial foray of blows. Gravity of 300 should even this up. Localized on myself, of course. Issei stated bluntly. Within a moment his clothes and mass struggled to drag him to the ground below, however the Super Saiyan remained aloft and shot toward his opponent once more. Despite the encumbrance upon him, he was still able to assault the dragon at a blistering pace. Strikes, crosses, hooks, uppercuts, vicious kicks, knees and elbows. All landed against Drake with ruthless precision and tremendous power. The increased gravity slowed Issei and drained his stamina along with the Super Saiyan transformation, but did nothing to lower his strength. For hours the pair continued to battle with the gravity that was encumbering Issei, growing higher and higher until the Saiyan was under a monumental 500 times the gravity of Earth. His very bones groaned at the exertion of simply remaining upright, let alone flying and fighting. His Super Saiyan transformation provided both the power to achieve this feat but also crippled his stamina to be able to fight in this manner for long. Close into the second hour of being under this insane pressure, Issei was forced to the ground by a swift overhead strike by Drake. No longer was he the dominant force in the super-powered bout and lay crumpled upon the ground. The gravity left him as the dragon landed beside him, and at the same time his hair and aura dropped away from golden. He was completely spent. In total exhaustion, Issei lay and laughed on the ground. The power of the Super Saiyan was incredible. Far beyond his wildest dreams, and he would continue to train it in this manner until he had total control over it. He would master it totally. Unbelievable. Without the absurd pressure you placed upon yourself, there is no possible way that I would have defeated you. Issei let his eyes drift over to Drake. His grin at the admittance of his friend's defeat by him was marred by the return of the crippling emotions that came from losing Aquino. Now that he was out of the Super Saiyan state, Issei was once again vulnerable and exposed to the maelstrom of his own turbulent emotions. For the next 4 days Issei and Rias busied themselves by undertaking as many tasks as they could while awake. No one denied them when either of the pair asked for work to be done and neither pressured them to return to school. Footage had been captured of the exploits in Osaka, mainly of the battle in the streets and parts of the demonic invasion and counterattack within the subway. It surfaced in the media and circled around the internet. As such, the school was informed bluntly by Gremory representatives that the peerage would be absent until they were able to return without giving a specific time frame. Ravel and Irina returned on the Tuesday when finding that they were not in the best place to assist the Gremory peerage members. Both understood the emotions that affected the immediate members of the peerage, but they also knew that it was simply a matter of time and space that would needed to help heal the wounds. It was plain to see that both Issei and Rias were ignoring their emotions through work and training. Sarah and Kaneko spent large portions of their day together with Kiba and Asia, who helped out on some work tasks for the leading pair. However, also returned to school themselves on Thursday, with Kaneko walking Sarah to and from school. The youngest girl proved herself to be quite resilient and able to move forward far better than any had expected of her. Issei and Rias, however, spent every minute of their days busy running errands, advising on enemy intelligence gathered and spending all their sleeping hours within the Mindscape training fiercely. Rias joined Drake in battling against the explosive power of her transformed boyfriend. By the second night, Issei had reached a point of being able to achieve his transformation with only a few moments of focusing on his ki. He would remain stationary, focus in on himself, finding the trigger and releasing his power in a dazzling and blinding flash of golden awe. Rias didn't hold back in the slightest and unleashed her emotions in the form of powerful destructive attacks against her boyfriend. The pair clashed with or without Drake, pushing each other as best as they could. Ria's ability and proficiency with unarmed combat grew in leaps and bounds as her dogged determination and desperate calculating mind absorbed every movement and strike of Issei before attempting to replicate and adapt them into her repertoire. To an outsider, it would seem that the super-powered pair were simply abusing each other and taking their frustrations out in a destructive manner. However, to the dragon that observed them, he could see that it was something far more. They were releasing their emotions and healing together while bonding over the new and shared experience of Ria's crash course in extensive hand-to-hand combat and Issei's mastery of his transformation. It was evident that this was an act of love between the two, as they would always finish simply sat away from the dragon with Rias in Issei's arms. The growth in both of their power and control was explosive as they continued to fight all throughout the long nights, neither willing to quit until it came close to dawn, when they would stop to embrace and hold each other. They would then allow themselves only up to 20 or so minutes of rest and calm before awaking and repeating the process. To those outside who viewed them, including their loved ones, their actions seemed avoidant and unsustainable. However, none could dissuade the Gremory heiress or Scion warrior. Asterisk abandoned shrine, Kamikatsu asterisk. Friday arrived and the whole extended peerage along with Surzex, Greyfiat and Issei's parents found themselves outside of an old and decrepit shrine. The shrine had remained abandoned since the last tender had been found murdered and her young daughter missing. This was the birthplace of Aquino and where she had lived until driven from her home by her estranged father. The shrine was laid out in a very traditional fashion. An arched entryway leading to a small paved courtyard. A minor deity's shrine to the left and visitor shrine to the right. Main lodge to the center, directly in the line of sight of visitors entering the complex. The main shrine contained the modern amenities of electricity, plumbing and utilities. However, the damage of vandalism and neglect meant that the buildings was now quite uninhabitable. The small wooden fence that once encircled the shrine complex had almost entirely succumbed to rot and the harsher elements of nature. It looked as if the surrounding woodland intended to reclaim the site for itself. A solemn air filled the space around the group and permeated their existence. All the men wore suits while the women Scion wore black long dresses, respectful of the passing of their beloved friend and family member. Rias carried a small dark-stained mahogany box in both hands as she walked through the grounds. In the central courtyard, the congregation stopped. With everyone present, Issei pushed his hands out before him and created a flat disk of energy. The energy then slowly lowered to the front of the group before cutting into the pavement and dirt slowly and cleanly. Within a moment, a smooth hole was produced that could house the box within Rias' arms. Without words being spoken, the devil Eris approached and slowly lowered the wooden box into the ground. Engraved on its lid was Akino Himojima, and inside lay her prized possessions as well as the clothes she had worn at her death. Her favorite jewelry, a plushie that Rias had bought her when they were young, and a few other prized effects. Once the stained box was laid down, Rias stepped back and lowered her head quietly. Each of those present then stepped forward and either said a quick word in remembrance or simply contemplated silently. Second last to approach was Issei, who looked toward the box for a moment before uttering almost inaudibly, "We will love you forever." With his words spoken, the Scion stepped back quietly and joined the group, who watched Graphia step forward. The Queen of Surzex was the last to speak. Her kind words brought a soft smile to the faces of those present, and it was clear that she had considered Akino family to herself in the same manner as Rias was her sister-in-law. With her words spoken, she extended her right hand to generate a glyph of ice that filled the remaining space around the simple carved box. A soft flash of translucent blue light shone before revealing that magical ice now filled the grave. The box of Akino's possessions remained clearly visible but safely enshrined. Engraved into the ice were the words, "Here lies the lover and companion who we will never forget. May the memory of her smile warm the hearts of those who knew her for all eternity." A minute of silence fell before the group began to disperse. Surzex and Graphia the first to depart. Issei's parents, Sebastian, Ravel, Irina, and Marie leaving shortly after. The humans being transported back to their home by the Lou Barton noble. Kiba and Asia remained for close to half an hour watching their peerage members remain by the grave. They both cared heavily for Akino, but none spoke, and so silence once more filled the air. Soon Kaneko and Sarah moved away to depart, and the former nun and her knight joined them. Only the two lovers of Akino remained. Issei sat by the grave while Rias stood, and both just looked at the ice and box within. Having no body to bury was something that both found painful, as if the final right that they could grant the girl they loved had been taken from them. The box provided by Ajuka and the ice from Graphia were beautiful nonetheless, and both were grateful, yet still it didn't quite fill that last part of their grievance that had taken by their foe. The sky shifted with clouds rolling across the blue expanse before a bouquet of colors tinted the sky to announce the imminent arrival of nightfall, yet the pair remained at the grave. Rias had moved herself to be within Issei's arms, and the pair simply allowed themselves the time for a final farewell with Akino. With the last rays of the sun's light cresting the horizon, Rias stood from the comfort of Issei's arms. She could leave, she felt able. She motioned to summon the Gremory sigil, yet her hand was caught by Issei. "Let's fly home." He simply offered his other hand to her, and she responded by unfurling her bat-like wings. The pair rose silently into the air. The soft beats of Rias' wings whisper quiet with the slow rate to which she moved them to keep her aloft. Issei himself flew without generating his aura. Neither were in a rush to return to the Hayadu residence and content to float through the air. Despite the ease with which they moved, it would still only take the pair a little over an hour to travel to Kaio, a simple result of the strength with which they held. Hand in hand the pair soared through the air, allowing bursts of speed to carry them upward in the air before dropping off their velocity to return to sailing back down toward the ground below while spiraling and twirling together, the pair almost forming a dance as they twisted and turned through the air together. Neither concerned with the world around them and simply enjoying the freedom of the cool air against their skin and the freedom of the empty skies. A small town sat between clusters of hills and woodland intermingled below the pair, the lights of civilization a patchwork throughout the streets and roads. Happily floating overhead, Issei noticed a spike of ki that caught his attention. Despite his lack of direct attention to his extra sense, the Scion warrior was always aware of the life force of those around him, With the power he now possessed, Issei constantly tracked and measured the potency of life for hundreds of kilometers around himself. When focusing, he could drive his skill further or narrow in on a specific location or locations to assess each exact signature. When in a passive situation like he currently was, he simply allowed the sense to push to background of his consciousness, like a radio left on or conversation in a packed theater. There and yet not intruding upon him. Yet still able to raise the alert if needed. It was this raising of an alert that caused the tailed warrior to bring the flight of himself and his girlfriend to a halt. Rias floated comfortably beside him and watched as his gaze dropped toward the streets below. The look of concentration upon his face let her know that Issei was tracking something, like a bloodhound to a scent. Without her scouter though, Rias would be reliant on Issei. Issei looked to her before speaking, the pair's enhanced vision allowing them to easily see one another in the darkness of the night. There are 5 heightened Shoki signatures down there. Rias waited for Issei to continue. There were 7 a moment ago, then 2 dropped rapidly. When people teleport out, their key signature moves or vanishes immediately. These ones didn't, they fell. The implication was obvious, dropping Shoki signatures likely meant that foul play was involved. With silent confirmation, the pair pivoted and spiraled down toward the small town. Rias looked to the stores. A drugstore, convenience store and bakery with neon lights brightly illuminating them. The name Daikansen present in each. She typed it quickly into her phone and the town flashed up. A little stop on the mountain roads north of Tokyo and within Sona's family's jurisdiction. Sona's family takes care of this area. She called to Issei as the boy nodded to her. After all, this could easily be a group of Citri devils conducting business or going about their own lives. Landing down on the grass of a small park to the end of a cul-de-sac that appeared to be of a lower economic standing, the Scion led the way toward a single-story home that was as nondescript as all the others around it. Each property occupied little over a few hundred square feet. Small homes for working-class families. Devils usually chose to live in finer homes than these, yet it could be that a family of the Citri clan had all sort of reasons to live here, from family connection to personal preference. Before slipping her phone away, Rias sent a short message to Sona asking if her clan had any members living within Daikansen. With both her boyfriend letting his tail sway freely in the air behind him and Surzek's encouragement to maintain the visibility of her wings in public, Rias simply folded hers across her back without dismissing them as they crossed the road toward the small driveway that ended in an open carport beside the home. Issei reached open the small chain gate that marked the entry to the pathway up to the front door of the property. Rias followed behind as they approached the building. The windows were dark with blinds fully drawn and doors closed. It was clear that there was no lights on in the rooms closest to the front of the house. At reaching the front door, Issei tried to turn the door handle and found it to be locked, which was unsurprising. He could easily break the lock or the door, but if these were friendly signatures, then that would be a rather rude action. As such, Issei rapped his knuckles on the door firmly and loudly. As the sound of his knocking echoed through the home, the signatures stopped moving. They became completely still and Issei watched their movements intensely. A pause seemed to flow between both parties before the group within the residence began to move. 2 of their group approached the front door through the house and Issei indicated this to Rias by raising his right hand, 2 fingers extended and pointing to the front door. The remaining 3 exited through a back entrance, window or door. Issei wasn't sure and began to circle around the building. 1 going to the right of the pair and 2 to the left. Issei further indicated this with his hands and Rias nodded in understanding as the pair remained silent. Sona had not responded to Rias' query yet, but the actions of the signatures seemed defensive at best and potentially hostile at worst. Issei adopted a relaxed posture while Rias moved away from him and into a patch of thick shadow created by the carport side walls where neither the moon nor street lights could illuminate. With Issei in a relaxed position within clear view, he would take up the immediate attention of any who viewed him, and such he stood with very relaxed posture, one that displayed confidence and a sense that he was meant to be here, while also allowing him to dominate the small front alcove. It would be natural for any potential enemies to focus on the Scion and not notice the separated Gremrieris.
Each strike the two made
The signatures themselves held a similar level of shoki to Kaneko, Sebastian, and Kiba. Strong warriors that clearly had an affinity for combat with most likely training to match, yet Issei remained completely calm. If they were hostile, then against the Scion their power would be like pebbles thrown at a mountain. He knew it was his Scion pride and mentality that caused him to dismiss them so easily, but considering his last forays against fallen angels and devils, it seemed only natural in his mind that he really had no reason to be concerned. The front door opened, partially revealing a man that Issei judged to be in his 30s, or to hold the appearance of being in his 30s. He wore a blue business suit that appeared to have been quickly tucked back in, as if the occupant had quickly attempted to appear more presentable. He had neatly combed blonde hair, green eyes, and pale skin. His eyes quickly glanced over the teen before him for a moment before addressing him. From his position it seemed that there was nothing out of the ordinary of the tall boy before him, Issei's tail out of sight behind his broad figure. "What do you want?" The man's voice somehow not right and dragged out in an inhuman fashion. Issei, being himself, decided to go with the best approach he could, the blunt approach. With a quick flash of a cheeky grin, Issei spoke to man before him. "Good evening, you may have heard of me. Issei Hayadu, Scion warrior of House Gremory." He watched the eyes of the man twitch as he spoke, yet continued before the man could respond. "I noticed there were 7 life signatures in this dwelling, but 2 dropped rapidly. Which, tells me that 2 people were just likely to have been killed in there. It got me thinking though, who is here and who was just killed, and of course, are they my enemies?" As the Scion spoke calmly, the man before him recognized the name and became increasingly cautious. Rumors of the Scion's fighting power were spreading rapidly through the supernatural world due to his performance in the raiding game and reports of his engagements in the current crisis. Using the door to block the Scion's vision, the man morphed his left hand into a reptilian claw as his partner beside him, completed obscured by his positioning of himself behind the heavy door, also produced a pair of light spears. Without a word, and as the Scion finished speaking, the pair launched their attacks against the teen with the light spears, thrusting through the door directly at the tall boy in time with the clawed arm, striking through with sharp nails pointed toward the Scion's throat. A small rupture of energy burst out simultaneously to the high-pitched pop of bursting energy as the spears collided with each other and the twisted claw swiped through the translucent image of the boy before them. The image flicked before vanishing, and the man stared with wide eyes for a moment before the dust of the shattered door cleared along with the last traces of the translucent teen. "So enemies then?" Issei spoke up away from them at the chain-link fence, where he remained in the ambient light of the moon and streetlights, sat casually upon the crossbar of the gate itself. Before him the 2 adversaries looked at him in irritation and disbelief. They had clearly expected their surprise attack to catch the boy off guard. With light falling on the pair fully now, Issei got a good look at them. The man who had spoken to him was no longer humanoid, but his body presented itself as serpentine from below the waist with dull burnt orange scales. Both of his arms shifting into the reptilian claws, while his upper body and face remained as they had been. His suit's disheveled appearance was now even more so than before. Beside him a humanoid-looking figure coated with thick gray fur, red tips along the portions that covered its head and back. The fur hung in the fashion of a wet dog and covered enough of the individual's face that Issei couldn't make out any specific animal traits other than that this individual was clearly a rogue devil. Rogues, huh? How about your friends? His answer came in the form of a volley of light spears that struck out from both sides and the sky above him. Issei had no need to move, though, as bolts of swirling red and black destruction energy intercepted them without any effort as Rias shot into the sky against the Grigori that hung there. Issei watched as Rias unleashed waves of magic against the 3 fallen angels while closing the distance to engage in hand-to-hand combat. His thoughts were brought back to earth at the heavy footfalls of the furred foe charging toward him. He allowed a confident smirk to cross his features as he stepped into the incoming path of the assaulting foe. His ki rocketed up within himself as he entered the monster's guard and slammed his right knee into its abdomen. Spit and blood projected from the foe's mouth and nose as its eyes widened in pain that had been caused by the powerful strike. Issei capitalized on the simple attack with a straight punch to the large opponent's face that launched the creature back like a ball from a cannon. The serpentine foe was close behind his ally and ducked under as it was fired over him and lunged toward Issei from a coiled position much like an angered viper striking at a target. Issei watched as the serpentine foe's body left the ground in slow motion as it launched itself toward him, and he simply leant back, dropping himself from a standing position and allowing his ki to catch himself in the air while he curled his legs into his chest. With the foe now in the air above him and unable to change its trajectory, Issei unleashed both his feet out against the chest of the rogue devil. The powerful strike collided with the torso of his foe, and Issei felt, while also hearing the definitive crack of ribs snapping before the massive snake-like foe was launched up into the air.
Kaneko shot forward.
Allowing his momentum to carry through, Issei rolled backwards over in a somersault before landing on his feet. With a short yell, his ki skyrocketed once again, the white aura enveloping himself, and he fired into the sky at breakneck speed in pursuit of the foe he sent airborne. In the seconds it took him to reach his quarry, Issei watched proudly as Ria struck a fallen angel with a series of well-executed strikes that broke through her opponent's guard effortlessly before unleashing a bolt of destructive energy at point-blank range, causing the body of her foe to erupt from the torso, the remaining mangled corpse atomizing before it could reach the ground. Without any strain, she twisted to avoid strikes thrown out by the other Grigori and engaged them as Issei grabbed onto the flailing tail of his prey. Firmly grasping the tail with his left hand, Issei wrenched the foe back, pulling it harshly toward himself and delivering a powerful right hook to the creature's jaw once in range. The devastating punch shattered the jaw, nose, and left eye socket of his opponent. A scream of pain left the mouth of the man that Issei didn't care for. There would be no mercy for his foes. What little mercy he had previously shown was now gone forever from his conscience. Effortlessly dodging a swiper from the clawed hand, Issei grasped the thick tail with both hands, his fingers penetrating the flesh and drawing a thick foul-smelling dark blood. Issei drew his arms back behind his head before thrusting forward and hurtling the rogue down toward the ground in front of the small home. The twisted rogue struck the ground with an almighty crash that shook the ground and set nearby car alarms off. The ground directly around its body cratered, and the bones of the demented being shattered throughout its body. Landing beside it, Issei looked into the ruined entrance of the building to see the furred rogue exiting to face him once more. This fight had gone for less than a minute so far, and yet Issei and Rias were controlling the flow of the battle so quickly that their enemies could hardly react to the changing circumstances. A scream of defeat echoed from an enemy above as Issei shot a small ki blast into the crumbled body of the snake-like rogue in the crater before him. The ki blast tore through the flesh of the creature, obliterating the torso, head, and arms of the foe, leaving behind only the mangled tail. As it detonated, Issei shot forward to meet the furred devil in close combat. Issei dodged under an overhead swipe while delivering a left hook into the armpit of the creature before weaving his head aside from another strike. He followed this with a series of jabs, crosses, and elbows that broke bones as they connected with his target. Desperation filled the eyes of his battered foe as the creature lunged forward with its teeth bared, clearly intent on biting the foe before it. A light spear generated in its hand that stuck the ground behind the nimble scion. Issei watched as the creature crossed into this path and caught the neck of the creature in an overhead lock of his left armpit before firing himself into the air and backward, colliding into the ground in a piledriver fashion. Blood fired from his foe's mouth at the impact, and Issei responded by planting his right hand over the foe's mouth and generating a small ki blast within the confines of its open jaw. The furred creature's eyes went wide for only a second before the cranium ruptured in a display of gore caused by the erupting ki blast. The carcass of his foe spasmed momentarily as Issei released and dropped it and proceeded to look up toward Rias. Issei watched as above his girlfriend wove around the final Grigori with pure finesse. The attacks of the fallen angel, be they strikes or light attacks, passing harmlessly around her as she shot in to deliver precise combinations of blows before separating apart, moving to gain the advantage of a new angle and assaulting again. Within moments of watching, Rias delivered an overhead two-handed hammer strike that sent the heavily bleeding foe crashing into the ground below. Issei sauntered over to the struck foe that lay bleeding heavily on the bitumen of the street. He stood over the fallen angel but struggled to breathe and coughed up swaths of blood as Rias landed down beside him while only breathing slightly heavier than usual. The older girl gave him a quick smile before turning to face her defeated foe.
What have you been doing here?
Rias asked to the angel abruptly.
Kokobel screamed as the pair clashed.
No words came from their defeated foe, who appeared close to losing consciousness or death, with clearly broken bones, mangled wings and what was likely to be a large number of internal injuries.
I ask you a question. Rias stated firmly while stepping on the foe and rolling the man to face up at her. The eyes of their foe lost focus and danced around aimlessly. Rias sighed in annoyance and removed her foot before setting her left hand out toward the angel.
A swirl of collecting red and black energy filled her palm before leaving her and passing into the defeated Grigori, atomizing it instantly.
Standing up straight, the heiress turned to her boyfriend with a quizzitive look. Let's take a look inside.
Issei nodded in agreement before leaning in to speak closer to her ear and in a lower voice. There are a fair few residents from the homes around us watching right now. I can feel their signatures by their windows and saw a few. We should probably be quick about this.
The
fight had lasted no more than a few minutes, with the powerhouse duo completely outclassing and overwhelming their enemies, yet the noise, earth-shattering quakes and ramifications of the engagement had drawn the attention of those living around the area, who were equal parts scared and curious of the events taking place outside of their homes. The fact that Issei's attacks had caused car alarms for a 3-block radius to sound had definitely been a contributing factor. Without wasting any time, the pair entered the home and began to systematically search through the residence. It had only been a matter of a minute when they found the cause of the enemy's presence here and the 2 previous key signatures. A pair of devils whose features were heavily disfigured from torture remained bound and lifeless to a set of chairs in the dining area of the small home's kitchen. Each devil bore considerable cuts to their body, especially around the hands, feet, genitalia, and faces. It was evident to the pair that these devils had been thoroughly tortured before either being executed or succumbing to their injuries.
A multitude of bloody instruments remained around them that had been used to perform the acts upon the unrecognizable pair. Do you know them?
Issei asked of his girlfriend. Rias shook her head solemnly. No, but we should take them to hell with us. I'm sure one of the families will know who they are and can give them the respects they deserve. Issei agreed with her thoughts and stepped around to the rear of the chairs holding the deceased pair. With minimal effort, he snapped the heavy chain bindings that had shackled the devils to their positions. He briefly considered how easily he was able to break the heavy metal by simply squeezing and applying force that to him felt like popping a tomato. This time last year he had been a fairly regular boy, and yet now this strength and conflict, often resulting in death, was common for him.
Issei took a hold of each devil and slung them over his shoulders.
It wasn't the most dignified way to carry them, but there really wasn't much option. He was grateful that he held a strong constitution and wasn't affected by carrying the recently deceased or their blood running down his chest and back. He would definitely have to change clothes before his mother saw him, though. So caught up in his thoughts and the situation had he been that it was only now that he realized in a rather abrupt fashion that a large number of low-key signatures were converging on their position. The sound of engines, both torque and rotary, could be heard approaching at high speed, and Issei looked to Rias. He knew that while she couldn't feel the presence of those incoming, she could definitely hear them.
Let's see what it is.
Issei both stated and asked. Against her better judgment, Rias agreed with him, and the pair made their way back through the house and out of the front door with the 2 bodies still slung over each of Issei's shoulders. Exiting the dwelling resulted in blinding light instantly illuminating the ground that the 2 lovers occupied, and both immediately regretted their choice not to leave from inside. Overhead, a group of helicopters floated in the air with their spotlights solely on the 2 teens. Black armored vehicles created a blockade at the entrance to the cul-de-sac with their lights focused on the duo as well. Heavily armed men in tactical gear filled the spaces around the vehicles with their automatic weapons trained on the teens, and a voice spoke from a speaker above them.
Put your hands in the air and move down to your knees. The voice spoke clearly from the electronically enhanced speakers and held a tone of expectant authority.
Issei sighed and simply looked to Rias. Nothing these people could utilize would affect him. His body was so tough through reinforcement from his ki that they could unload all of their firepower into him and it would fail to even bruise the scion, but he wasn't sure that would be the same case for his girlfriend. Devils could still be harmed by conventional weapons if caught unawares or unable to counter the fire directly. Regardless of that, neither Rias nor Issei wanted to harm average people, and judging from the signatures of all those within kilometers of them, there was only humans present.
Issei's only targets were abyssal creatures, robed devils, and fallen angels.
Those that sought harm against others, and of course Biko, but that was entirely personal.
Two options were the only ones present: comply or teleport away. Flying would result in weapons being fired which could either hurt Rias or innocent bystanders from stray shots.
Rias gave him a pensive look back before offering a soft smile and raising her hands.
Issei felt a twinge of annoyance to his pride at being forced into this position of surrender, but rationalized it with the fact that these people were in no way his equal or relevant foes. As such, he returned to facing forward and shrugging his shoulders to drop each of the bodies to the ground, while he also raised his hands into the air.
Down to your knees.
The voice commanded again, and Issei couldn't help but notice that it was a female voice. Both teens dropped themselves down into a kneeling position with their hands in the air and watched as 8 of the air medmen approached them in pairs. Each pair ensured that they never crossed paths of each other and left themselves able to keep all of their weapons open to engage the two supernatural beings should they act in a hostile fashion. Once reaching the teens, a pair kept their weapons aimed at each while a further pair approached each teen. One man took a hold of each of their arms with their weapons slung and began to handcuff them behind their backs, while the other man took a hold of their elbows and lifted them up to their feet. The actions were rough but not harmful. However, once on their feet and being moved toward the closest armored vehicle, Issei refused to budge and felt the man pushing him from behind with utter futility. Before the man could speak, Issei spoke loudly while starting to walk forward of his own accord.
We will comply, but if any of you harm Rias, I will unleash more power than a nuclear detonation on you all and slaughter each and every single member of your organization. No verbal response came to Issei's declaration. However, he smirked at the heightened feelings of nervousness he could feel emanating from those around him and was pleased to see the man leading Rias instantly remove his hand from the girl's back, allowing her to walk without any physical guidance. Both teens were directed toward different vehicles silently, and before being ushered into the back of the closest armored vehicle, Issei locked eyes with Rias, who smiled to him before climbing into the rear entrance of the vehicle ahead of the one he was to be put in. Issei shrugged the man's hand off him, who began to push him up into the vehicle, and with a glare at the man utilized a small portion of his ki to float up into the vehicle and sat down in the seat that another man already inside the armored carrier pointed him to. Despite the goggles, face wraps and helmets obscuring their facial features, Issei could tell that his quick display of flying, albeit more floating, had the men feeling even more uncomfortable. With Issei seated and the man opposite him having clipped the seatbelt over the handcuffed teen, the 4 who moved with him climbed aboard, closed the doors and took their seats before the vehicle began to move. Issei sighed and focused his consciousness entirely on Rias' key signature. Only a single thought came to him while he focused on his girlfriend: what nonsense were they involved in now?